She's alive! Alive!
Hello, and welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism. This is Anna, co founder of the Final Girls and your podcast host. In this season, we'll be tracing the lineage of female monsters through cinema. In each episode, I'll be joined by a special guest to dive deep into a monster movie. And today, we'll be talking about two sequels to two iconic horror monsters, The Bride of Frankenstein and Dracula's Daughter. As with the first film, Bride of Frankenstein, which was released in 1935, was directed by James Whale and stars Boris Karloff as the monster and Elsa Lanchester as the bride. Picking up directly after the events of the first film, Dr. Henry Frankenstein abandons his plans to create life only to be tempted and finally coerced by his old, quite mad mentor Dr. Pretorius, along with the monster, into building a bride for him. The original Frankenstein film was like the Jaws of its time, and this sequel is widely considered to be an improvement on it, with the bride becoming the first female monster to achieve true pop culture icon status. Later on in this episode, we'll be diving into a somewhat lesser known but no less interesting sequel, Dracula's Daughter from 1936. Picking up directly after Dracula is vanquished by Van Helsing in the first film, this one introduces Countess Maria Zaleska, the daughter of Count Dracula and herself a vampire. Countess Zaleska believes that she can be freed from her father's influence after his death, but when she still craves blood, she starts seeing a psychiatrist. Honestly, I can't recommend this film enough. It's such an intense and weird take on the troubled vampire, something that we've seen so much in later films and TV shows. I'm joined in this episode by Dr. Sabina Stent to discuss both films and what makes them so insanely watchable even now. Hi, Sabina. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
No, hi Anna. Thank you so much for having me. We're in the middle of a lightning storm here, so it's the perfect atmosphere to discuss these two films.
I love it. It's gonna be if lightning strikes or if there's thunder in the middle of this recording, I'm gonna be so into it.
Okay, brilliant. Well, I'm right by a window, so you never know.
So in this episode, we're going to be talking about one of the most iconic screen monsters in cinema history and another one that's not as famous. So we're going to be talking about The Bride of Frankenstein from 1935 and Dracula's Daughter from 1936, which are both female-centered follow-ups to two classic universal monsters. Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster, really, and Dracula. So to kick off, can you talk a little bit about your relationship with these films?
Yeah, of course. I was already very familiar with Bride of Frankenstein. I must have seen it like many years ago, but I also think it's one of these films that I knew. I can't remember if I knew the visuals before I'd even seen the film, if that makes sense, because it's such an iconic looking film.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I recognized the imagery before I'd even seen the film, even though I'd watched it, many years ago. And it's always been, one of my favorites from the Universal horrors of the 1930s. But I wasn't familiar with Dracula's Daughter, even though I was already a fan of Dracula. Um, so I was quite delighted to watch them and see how they they compare, and they have so many, in a way, similarities to some extent, but also how you can see how they've paved the way very much so, um, for future films. But I think the bride, I think especially the bride, she's just such an iconic, beautiful, eternal film. I love it a lot. I love her a lot.
I mentioned it before that The Bride and Dracula's Daughter are kind of follow-ups to these two iconic films. So where did these films sit within 1930s horror, which is when these horror films, and particularly with Frankenstein and Dracula, really broke through and were making crazy box office money, but also legitimizing horror films on a big screen to a degree, and obviously made Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi, respectively, into massive stars. So where do these sequels sit within that canon of 1930s horror?
Well, they were both really the first to have female monsters, if you know, if you can call them monsters. um, so, well, because the you know, it's so interesting though about the bride being called a monster, because
Hmm.
she doesn't do anything. She doesn't do anything. She's in she's just has the most spectacular role in spectacular, part of a horror film, and just barely 5 minutes. So they were both the first female monsters. They originally, James Whale, who directed Bride of Frankenstein, and he had directed Frankenstein. He originally didn't want to do this one because he didn't want to do a sequel. Um, James Whale, who directed both Bride of Frankenstein and Frankenstein, he originally didn't want to do the sequel, um, but he did it because obviously he was being, the huge popularity of the first, and
Hmm.
he was originally touted to do Dracula's daughter, and he didn't want to do that one because Bride was so popular. The studio thought we've got a winner here, we've got a good formula. We'll keep going. But in terms of the canon 1930s horror, I think what's interesting that before that, the the monsters, the creatures, however we want to label them, they
Hmm.
were they were meant to be frightening. They were meant to be scary. We were meant to be in fear of them. And these two roles, they just changed that. They just, mid 30s, and from then on, you could see that monsters weren't always scary. They
Hmm.
didn't have to, they're not necessarily um, a product of their counterparts. They're very different sequels, both of them, um, and they have, they're more empathetic, more humanized in some ways. So they
Hmm.
just brought in they brought in entertainment to the horror
Hmm.
section, if we want to say that, because when James Well made Bride, he originally didn't want to do it because he had achieved everything he wanted to do with Frankenstein. Um, so with this one, his outlook, or his opinion was, well, I'm going to make it entertaining,
Hmm.
and it's hugely entertaining. I mean, it's very fun. There's humor in it that we don't have in the first one,
Hmm.
and there's some silliness to it, which is really rather nice.
Let's dig in then properly into The Bride of Frankenstein.
I do think it a shame, Mary, to end your story quite so suddenly.
That wasn't the end at all. Would you like to hear what happened after that? I feel like telling it. It's a perfect night for mystery and horror. The air itself is filled with monsters.
I'm all ears.
The Bride of Frankenstein.
So how does it you started talking about it a little bit, but how do you think this updates Wales' original film?
Um, I think it updates it because it affirms that this isn't so much of a sequel, because obviously the bride is in the book. She's a condition, though. She's not a physical character. And also in Frankenstein, the credits, it said based on the novel by, did it say the novel by Mrs. Percy Shelley, which
Hmm.
was, instead of, which was a bit, you know and
Yeah.
in this one it does say Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. And they also affirm the connection that Mary Shelley had with this character she created by having that prologue at the beginning.
Yeah.
with that prologue that fell, how all of the censors that they had to cut some out.
Yeah, we have to talk about that prologue. So in this first scene that opens the movie, we actually see Mary Shelley, who is played here by Elsa Lancaster, who also then plays the bride, and Percy and Lord Byron sort of getting together again, hanging out, I guess. What did you make of that prologue scene?
A very genteel version of what actually went on. Well, we're led to believe went on that night and on that kind of holiday, whatever you want to call it, when they were all in that house together.
Is it meant to be that night?
I don't know, actually. I don't know if it is. I
mean, I thought it was because I mean, I'm low key obsessed with that holiday trip that they all took, but I thought because they already speak about Mary Shelley having written Frankenstein.
That's true.
Byron and Percy are like, "Oh, are you gonna tell us another horror story, Mary?" But you're right, they're both kind of so foppish and not at all in the way that at least we know Byron and Shelley to have been.
It wasn't quite the mad, bad, dangerous to know Byron that was so notorious. Yeah, I mean, I wondered if this film hadn't been subjected to the code, if we would have a little bit more. But obviously, they had to cut out like 15. Was it 15 minutes? They had to cut 15 minutes or 8 minutes. There's like a chunk that had to be omitted, and I don't know if it was mainly to do because of her, décolletage with her gown on, exposing too much flesh, and I think it was things like that but I think it's quite what and that we see it when we see this montage, this not montage, this prologue. I think it's quite funny, and I think it just sets up the film by affirming her place and also affirming that this film is going to entertain. It's not going to be anything necessarily frightening. But I also think it's interesting that they affirm that this is, wickedness comes from the minds of, dear sweet Mary, as they call her at one point, and how can this very, lovely creature bore such a creation.
Yeah, I really loved it as a wink to the fact that Mary Shelley is the author of Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus. The fact that these images, and this enduring sci-fi horror story sprung from her, and she wrote it when she was 18. But I think I don't know if you read it this way. Maybe I'm just a little bit obsessed right now with that novel and with Shelley, but I sort of read it as a little wink to the fact that perhaps in the original Frankenstein, like you mentioned, her authorship wasn't as mentioned or as platformed as in this film. But also because the book, when she originally published it, because she published it anonymously, as female authors tended to do quite a bit, I think. But Percy Shelley wrote the introduction. People assumed that he had written Frankenstein, and I think, in fact, a lot of people at that time assumed that he had written it, but also some people still are trying to make a case, trying to prove that Percy Shelley actually wrote Frankenstein and not Mary.
Yeah. Oh gosh.
That was a really rambly way of asking. Do you think it's a little nod to reaffirming the fact that she's the mother of Frankenstein?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's just strange that some people still believe that she didn't write this book. Because but that obviously happens with any woman authors. Her her authorship will be called into question, especially with, when she was with someone as well known as Shelley. Yeah, I mean, but I think it's good. I do like that they did that, and they were like, no, this is her work. Yeah, her work. It didn't come from the minds of these two men. It came from the mind of this young woman.
Amazing. And let's talk a little bit about the bride herself, because she does feature in the book, in the original book,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
I how does the film sort of update her? Because she, if I recall correctly, she never actually materializes in the book, but she is
No, no,
Frankenstein, as
she
in Victor
starts to.
Frankenstein. Yeah, begins to build her, right?
He does, yes, and then he destroys her.
Mm,
He is the one who destroys her because he doesn't want to have, this other creature, um, like terrorizing people or frightening people as the his first creation has been doing. Um, so I like that they make her physical in this one. We actually see her as I don't want to say living, but
mhm,
animated and animated, and those incredible movements that Elsa Lancaster does. She is just she is like a I love the way they created her look. The
mm,
brilliant Jack
yes.
Pierce with the Nefertiti style hair. So she's like a sort of horror goddess.
Mm,
She is not frightening to look at. She's beautiful. Um, and I remember reading that they didn't want like a
yeah.
grotesque, female monster. They wanted her to be gorgeous, and she is. And she's just got that very faint kind of scarring or stitching around her jawline and around her. I believe it's kind of bit around her temples,
Mhm,
but not as stapled, not like the staple that obviously the first creature has.
mhm.
Um, so I like the way they make her physical by her sound, the sound she emits, by her movements, by this kind of frightened, appalled. She looks appalled because she just looks so shocked to be there, to be present.
Mhm.
Um, and obviously in
Yeah,
this white gown, in this like beautiful bridal virginal white gown. Um, so I
yeah.
just think the whole combination is just so perfect.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. You know, there's always, I mean, she is beautiful, and I have a lot of issues with the fact that, it is designed to for her to not be horrific in the same way as Frankenstein's
Yeah.
monster is horrific. But I also have to love the look because it's all just slightly on the edge of the monstrous. Like she's got this beautiful white gown, which sort of works as both a hospital gown and a
Yes.
bridal dress, a bridal gown, and also just has these, her sleeves are bandages, and it's all just covered up to her neck. It's very sort of like shapeless, but at the same time creates this great sort of bulky shape as well around her, which
Yes.
Boris Karloff's monster also has. Like he's sort of too big to really be a regular man. Like there is something monstrous about the shape of him. And there is also something almost like doll like about the bride.
Yeah, she is very doll-like, isn't she?
Yeah. Yeah, it's like she's literally been made from pieces in the same way as the monster has, but still has to sort of be beautiful and
Yes.
sort of, but that has that edge, like the hair that you mentioned, like a goddess, but also is a bit, mad and has that streak of white. Like everything, she seems also like jerky in her movements, as if she's just been,
Mhm.
which we know she has, like electrocuted. So there's always just
Yes.
something off about the way that she moves, and it's all down to Elsa Lancaster.
Yes. And she's got those beautiful expressive eyes And
Yes.
she just so much. Obviously, she just shrieks that
Mm,
shriek that she based on swans, the hissing of swans, and which is just so fabulous when you think about how she used her influence for that sound, and she just her darting around eyes, just taking everything in, and um, she's just does so much with zero dialogue, and just she's there and then she's gone. She's an apparition in many ways. She's kind of
oh yeah.
this beautiful go I don't want to keep saying beautiful, but she's this fantastic, like, ghostly
Mm,
creature who's there one minute, she's gone the next, because the whole film is in many ways, most of the film is leading up to her creation, and then as
mm.
soon as she's there, she's just gone, which is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I'd forgotten before we watched it that, the film is called The Bride of Frankenstein. The whole thing hinges on her, and she's the key kind of promotional element, and is still one of the most iconic, if not the most iconic, sort of female monster in Hollywood cinema history because of her look. But you're right, we just get about 5 minutes of her, and
I,
she
th-
just
I think I
does
timed it,
great.
and it
Did
was
you?
about 5 minutes. I think it was about 5 minutes. I don't even think it was like less than 10, maybe just over five. But yeah, and it's an unreal. It's just unreal.
But I love the fact that even in those 5 minutes, she has some agency. Like she rejects
Yes,
the thing that she's been created for, which is basically to be a companion and a bride to the monster. And she just goes, nah. But in a
yeah,
screechy way.
yes, yes. Is that first glance when she sees him, and then that's it. She is not. No, she can't be manipulated.
Mm,
She's been fashioned from all these pieces, but at the same time, she cannot be manipulated to be with this creature. And I read somewhere quite interesting. It was saying how Frankenstein and the crazy, Pretorius, are
yeah.
like the other Doctor. Like that, he's a madder version of Frankenstein, Pretorius is, and then you've got the bride who's like a sort of madder version of the creature, and so they're
Okay.
faced with their mirror images in this film, which is quite interesting. I thought,
Oh, I
that
love
is
that.
something I hadn't thought about before, but I was like, yeah, it's that you can really see how they come against something who is pretty much them, but an
Hmm.
extreme version. Because the actual creature, he softens a lot in this film.
Hmm.
He has more dialogue. He is um even like his physicality changes, like his
Hmm.
hair will change. Like his
Hmm.
hair, kind of grows, and his scars heal. So but she is just, that bolt of lightning that she's been created with, and then that's it.
We have to talk a little bit about the mad scientist approach because actually for a good chunk, I want to say maybe the first third of the film, we actually don't see the monster, or and obviously not the bride like we
No.
mentioned before. So we spend a lot of time with Victor Frankenstein and with Pretorius,
Mhm.
who
Yes.
you mentioned it a little bit before, but would you like to elaborate a little bit on who this mad dude is?
Yeah, he's just the most bonkers, like, mad scientist, isn't he? He is the epitome of a mad scientist. When you think, Dr. Frankenstein is kind of, unhinged and a loose cannon,
Mm-hmm.
but he has nothing on this guy. Um, and those absurd experiments he does, creating life and their miniature life, and he has them. What does he call them? He gives them a specific name. Those, he's got his king and his queen and his ballerina in the
Oh,
glass.
I forgot what he
Yeah,
called
what were
them.
they?
I just remember
Yeah,
being completely like stumped because I totally
yeah.
blanked about the little creatures. And then when he displays them to Frankenstein, I remember even just like looking at it, it's like, am I, what? This is hilarious.
There are moments in the film when you forget this is like, Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein, because you're like, where is this going? Where is
Yeah.
this going? It's because it's so absurd. And I think that was the point. He was there to add, like, the character was there to add this comedic, entertaining humor that the first film didn't have. But it just really takes it to the extreme. And it's yeah, it's so bonkers. It's great.
And just to start wrapping up the conversation about this film, and before we move on to Dracula's daughter, what do you think it's been about The Bride that's made her so iconic in the cultural consciousness? The fact that we still instantly recognize her from a single image of her profile.
I think a lot is to do with the look. I think a huge amount's to do with the look.
Mm-hmm.
It's a look that has been replicated. I'm sure many people have done it on Halloween. Even The Simpsons. I think, was it Marge or
Yeah.
Maggie, the replica, was dressed as the bride on a treehouse of horror. So it's even something that children will recognize, even if they haven't seen the film. It's
Mm.
just such a, it's a, visual image, powerful visual image. But I also think it's the combination of her silence, that
Mm.
she has, no dialogue apart from, this hissing. And I also think it's that she is, um, like a villain or a monster or a creature,
Mm-hmm.
but she doesn't do anything. She doesn't do anything apart from, kind of, yeah, be created, be born,
Mm-hmm.
and reject her intended, and then she's gone. And I think that's it. The fact that she's just, it's the most, interesting. You can call it a cameo in her own film to some extent, because she is barely there, but it's just such a powerful, you know 5 to 9 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
however much we get. It's you can watch the film, but that scene is what you will remember, and I think that's
Mm.
what makes it so enduring. um that you're watching and you're waiting for her, and then as soon as she's there, she's gone.
And do you think it's a film that contemporary horror fans could still enjoy?
Oh yes, very, very, very much so. And I think everyone will get something out of it. And I think it's just the combined elements of the horror, the comedy, the entertainment, the visuals, and just I think it's a spectacular horror films. I think the Universal horror films are always wonderful anyway, but I think this
Mm-hmm.
particular one really, really stands the test of time. I think it's great, and I think it's wonderful when you always hear how audiences are rediscovering it and watching it for the first time. And I think, it's just such a great, powerful visual,
Mm-hmm.
image, and it's a great book as well. We love Mary Shelley's, and we love Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. So I think it's just such a great book and great film.
Thank you. And now moving on to Dracula's daughter.
Dracula! He's come back!
Sandra, look at me. What do you see in my eyes?
Yes.
Do you like jewels, Lily? This is very old and very beautiful. Please don't come any closer.
Which is the direct sequel to the 1931 Dracula. And it literally picks up the story minutes after the end of the events of the first film. But this time there's no Bela Lugosi. It's not directed by Todd Browning, and we have a female vampire as our protagonist slash monster of the film. So, what did you make of Countess Valeska taking over the mantle from Dracula?
I think she's so interesting because I was very unfamiliar with this particular film. I can't remember having watched it, or if I had, I hadn't really remembered. It was that long ago, but I don't think I had. I think it's so interesting because it's very much updates the Dracula myth, and it feels a very modern film
Mm.
for what it's saying and what it does. Um, but I like the fact that she's very much of a bit like Frankenstein, a bit like the creature. She is
Mm.
a tortured monster because she doesn't relish as much as Dracula. You know, she feels she doesn't. You know, she doesn't like the fact that she's having to suck people's blood. She considers her condition a curse.
Mm.
Um, and I think there's so many interesting points that they make in this film that I think have really kind of set the path for the tortured vampire in like popular culture that we want to call it.
Oh my god, yes, I think you're so right. You know, even I'd not seen this film before starting to prepare for this season, and it was shocking to me just how influential I think it is without many people having kind of, you know, tracing back this idea of a dandy, articulate, perfectly sort of, you know, presentable fancy vampire who's actually incredibly tortured by her status as a vampire. And it's inevitable that we compare her to Bela Lugosi's Dracula because that is, you know, that's the direct companion piece. But Bela Lugosi's Dracula is sort of very positioned as a sort of as a foreign seducer. You know, he doesn't speak that much. It's all in
Yes.
his eyes. You know, he is sort of very much kind of literally comes from a foreign land. You know, we meet him in a castle, all of this business, whereas Countess Zaleska is a metropolitan sort of, you know, socialite. We meet her in a big city. She has the, you know, this title. People know her. People talk about her. She, you know, sort of is. I mean, and I hate this word, but she's sort of, you know, presented as being exotic looking, and she's described as such.
Yes.
But she's, you know, perfectly fitting into high society and, you know, dresses the part and gets invited to the parties. People want to meet her. You know, she's, you know, for lack of a better word, an integrated vampire.
Yeah, and I think that is something that we've definitely seen in films, especially films and books. Later on, I think Anne Rice's Chronicles um,
Yes.
offer a huge, would obviously rely huge on this, owe a lot to this film, and I think she did. I read that Queen of the Damned was very heavily influenced by this film, but I also think her kind of, you know, her vampires in their beautiful jewels, in their sort of, you know, velvets waistcoats, attending society balls in the 16th century and socializing,
Mm.
and mixing in high society adds so, you know, offers so much to this, because I just think it's you didn't think of, obviously, um, Dracula is there in his castle. He's in Transylvania. He's you know, in his lair, and she's just this woman who's moving quite freely and who everyone seems to be fascinated by, and they just want, you know, she's like the most, you know, she's like the hot new socialite that they're all intrigued by. Um, and so I think from that point of view, it's very, very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously there were nods to the predecessor, its predecessor. It's nods to
Yeah.
heavy nods to Dracula. But you know, when we see her, her eyes are highlighted. You know, her beautiful her you know, we focus on her eyes. We just see her
Yeah.
eyes, very much like with Dracula, with his, you know, eyes being illuminated.
Mm-hmm.
Her ring that she uses to like hypnotize people is a bit like when Bela Lugosi used to use his hands to hypnotize people.
Yes.
Um,
Can we talk a little bit about her sort of the violence in this film, so the actual horror, because it's very bloodless, I thought, like quite cerebral, because we
yes,
never really see her bite anyone, and like you just mentioned, she uses her
no.
ring to hypnotize her victims as opposed to physically attack them. Kind of, what did you make of this? What did you make of the horror of the film?
I always think it's when you can't see, and sometimes you can't see anything but you know what's going on, and
Hmm.
it's when so much horror is what your mind, the pictures your mind puts together. um so not seeing it can be as effective, if not more, than actually seeing all the blood and all the gore. It's psychological in many ways, but I think a lot of this film, obviously, it fell foul to censorship, so they couldn't show so much. They couldn't show certain things, but I think not seeing things is extremely effective. But I also think it's adds to the sexual angle of the film. It's like they cut away. It's like certain films cut away to the sex scene. This cuts away to the drinking, if you want to call it
Hmm.
that. Um, and so I think there's lots of kind of doubles that we can read in this particular one.
Yeah, and one of the most, I mean, this what a couple of really interesting articles I've read about the film that I link in the show notes, kind of really, and I saw that. I mean, personally, I saw this very clearly in the film as well, and I'm curious to see what you think. Is kind of the reading of Countess Oleska as a queer character, and notably the fact that she's mainly pursuing young female victims. So victims is a strong word. She's pursuing young women to as her sort of prey, and there's also this element of kind of her as a vampire going to therapy, which in itself
Yes,
is something we see then quite a bit later on in pop culture. But also there's this reading that I find really interesting of sort of her as a lesbian character sort of going to therapy to quote unquote fix herself, which I think is quite a,
yes.
a strong reading. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I think that is hugely telling, and I also think it's something that again we have seen in films with kind of this affliction being something that can be cured elsewhere. So you have all these like lesbian and homoerotic undertones a lot with a lot with modern vampire films anyway. Um, but I think it's telling that obviously she only kind of, I don't want to say hunts, but hunts, goes after women, young women, um, and it's just she wants to be, her curse is her sexuality. So it's very very modern for what it does. In many ways, it feels almost noirish in as a horror film, because there's so many taboo subjects that seem to be going on.
Mm,
Um, but I just think it's really really interesting in terms of how it explores her sexuality, and um, because obviously we have it was later on, wasn't it? It was more like in the 80s horror films where
mm-hmm,
vampires were as a commentary on AIDS and on sort of other venereal diseases because of the blood.
mm-hmm.
But I think in this particular one, it's just fascinating to have this high society woman who just feels so out of she doesn't she feels so out of place with who she is, and she feel like she can't you know she feels wrong. She feels like there's something
Mm-hmm.
wrong with her, and obviously, whatever she wants to do, anything to, I'm not saying be normal, but be cured. And it's in this case, the vampirism functions as a double. So it's both her sexuality and her curse, her blood curse as well. So I think it's very interesting.
And what did you make of Gloria Holden, of her performance as Alaska?
Oh, she's really wonderful. I think she's just so very composed, very still. I read that she didn't want to do the role because
Yeah.
she thought she would be typecast from then on. Um, and so she seems very like almost has this disaffected air by the role. By when she plays the part, she doesn't bristle with it with enthusiasm, and I think that just
Mm,
enhances this character who's playing not necessarily a cold society woman, but she's playing this kind of very composed, very slightly holds herself back a bit.
mm.
And I think it's a really great understated performance.
Yeah, I read as well that she didn't want to take on the role because she'd seen what had happened to Lugosi, who was never really able to shake the character of Dracula and was
Yeah.
incredibly typecast not just in horror films but also as Dracula, and kind of kept coming back to that role in increasingly demeaning ways. And I think she was a contract player at Universal, and this was going to be her first leading role, and she didn't want it to be as
Yes.
iconic in a way. But I think you're
Yeah.
right. There is sort of a almost resistance in her performance. Like she's keeping something back,
Mm.
and weirdly, I think it really works for this particular character because I think she's always Countess Alaska seems to me to be always trying to repress something inside herself and never really lets
Yes.
herself be fully who she is or even lash out. You know, she's sort of a very self-possessed vampire.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. She's not the flamboyant vampire
Yeah.
that we were, used to. And it's a very it's a very interesting performance. It's a very it's just nice to have that instead of that kind of lavish vampire throwing their way to
Mm,
that. Just to, to have someone slightly on their guard.
yeah. And we spoke quite a bit about the influence that the bride has had and how iconic she is, and we've spoken as well about kind of the influence that this film has had, maybe despite not being as recognizable. Even on all of the Blu-ray packs of Universal Classics and stuff, The Bride of Frankenstein is always on there, but never once is Dracula's daughter on there. So why do you
No, it's
think
surprising.
it's yeah, and why do you think it's not sort of had that iconic status as much as The Bride did?
I don't know if it's because it's a more nuanced, subtle film, um, and it's not as obviously a vampire film as maybe Dracula is. Um, so if she had been in her mansion, in her castle in Transylvania, it might have been hugely popular. Um, I think people don't see her as the monster that the title claims her to be.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also, I'm not sure. This is going to sound very kind of, wrong to say, but I don't know if James Whale's name had been attached, it might have done better box office because obviously his
Mm,
name was such a draw at the time. Um, I just think it was a combination of various factors, really. But it doesn't so much feel. It's very. I've said before, it feels very noirish, and I think maybe it falls into that kind of as like a horror noir. So I feel
mm-hmm.
um, it's maybe not monstrous enough to be a horror film, and I think because she doesn't look like the bride, she doesn't have this elaborate outfit, this have this elaborate costume or something, and she dresses very all in black but very tailored, very still beautifully. And I think the fact that she's a monster who doesn't look like a monster in many ways, and I think maybe people wanted her to be more of a monster than she actually was in the film.
To wrap up, do you think it's a film that horror fans should watch?
I think so. Yeah, I also think if you've watched, Buffy, if you watch The Angel, if you watch True Blood, The Vampire Chronicles, read The Vampire Chronicles, if you're very much into these kind of tortured vampires who are yearning to be human and experience mortality, I think it's definitely one that you'll enjoy and be interested in, and you will see how it's kind of paved the way for those films more recently. So I would definitely recommend it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sabina, for your time and for your insight. And where can people find out more about your work online?
You can find me on Twitter, just at Sabina Stent, and you can find links to my work and everything there. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
And that's it for another episode of the Final Ghost podcast. Please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and subscribe on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find out more about what we do on thefinalghost.co.uk and follow us on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook at The Final Ghost UK. You can also follow Sabina on Twitter at Sabina Stent, and I tweet a lot of cat pictures and monster gifs on Anna B. Demented. Thank you for listening, and join us next week for a deep dive into some 1950s weirdness.